This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Good morning, everyone. Bruchim haba and welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It gives us tremendous chizuk that we all came together this morning to mechazik ourselves, to mechazik our community, to mechazik our families in this very difficult time. May today's learning be a zechus for our families, for our community, and for all of Klal Yisrael. Especially to be learning on a legal holiday, a time that people are off from work. There's an amazing comment of the Chida in Tehillim. The Chida in Parak Ayin Hey says on the pasuk, Ki ekach moyed ani meisharim eshbait. Literally, I will take the moyed, the Yom Tov, the festival, and I will judge fairly. The Chida writes in the Sefer Yosef Tehillos that the main responsibility of a Jew in this world is Talmud Torah, is using one's time constructively for the purpose of learning Torah. However, were Hashem to judge a person ordinarily, very often a person would have a valid reason why we don't always have the opportunity to use our time to its fullest. So the Rebbeinu Shalom says, look, I'm going to judge you fairly. Ki ekach moyed. The way I'm going to determine whether you use your time properly is ki ekach moyed. I'm going to look at your moyed. I'm going to look at your Shabbos. I'm going to look at your Yom Tov. I'm going to look at your days off. If those days are spent properly, spent productively, then in fact that shows that had you had the availability, had it not been for the oil of Parnasa, you would have learned. So then you'll have a favorable judgment. However, if those days are not spent properly, that also is indicative that when a person is working, that's not the reason why perhaps the person is not using their time wisely. So the barometer of a person's ultimate judgment, ki ekach moyed, says Rebbeinu Shalom, I'm going to look at the moyed, the days off, ani meisharim eshbait, and then I'll be able to judge favorably. It's a particular honor for our Kehillah and for me personally to be able to join with Rav Frankel Shlita and the Agudas Yisroel of the 5 towns. It's an honor for me to be the Rav's neighbor and to be the personal beneficiary of davening in this Beis HaKnesses on a regular basis, to have a Talmid Chacham of such caliber like Rav Frankel on my block and in our vicinity. It's a kavod for me. It's a kavod for the whole city. Like Rashi says in the beginning of the Parsha, that when a Talmid Chacham is in the city, hu haida, hu ziva, hu hadara, and that's how we feel about Rav Frankel Shlita, eminent Talmid Chacham, someone who is close to Gedolei Olam, and our humble bracha is the Rav should continue gesundheit to be manig as Kehillah l'shemo teferes ad bias goyel tzedek. This is a time like no other. I don't think in our lifetimes we ever experienced this type of uneasiness in the air, this type of fear. And we want to be able to put in a proper context. What should we think? What should we feel? What can we do? You know, as we know, of course, there's 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, and yet there are certain things that transcend even just mitzvahs. There are going to be certain very fundamental questions that one day we're going to have to answer. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Shabbos that after 120, one of the 6 main questions that a person will be asked is Tzipisa Yeshua. Did you await, did you yearn, did you pine for the coming of the redemption? Which is very difficult. This is one of the 6 questions. Is it even one of the 613 mitzvahs? Do we find that Hashem in the Torah tells Klal Yisrael, you're commanded to await the coming of Mashiach, and yet after 120, one of the 6 primary questions that a person will be asked is Tzipisa Yeshua. Let's try to identify, especially at a time like this, that we sense the footsteps almost. We know we're be'ikvasa de Mashiach. Gedolim already from 2 generations ago told us. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman told us. We're living in the era of ikvasa de Mashiach. So let's try to identify and bring in a more realistic way how we could fulfill this great obligation of Tzipisa Lishua. Are there intervals, are there junctures that are designated that we could be Mekayim? It's more than a mitzvah, this great ideal. So firstly, the Arizal on the Shara Kavanos tells us that there are 2 brachas in Shemona Esrei that seem to be speaking about the same subject. We have the bracha v'Yishalayim Ercha Barachavim Tashav, and we have the bracha Samach David Avdecha Mehira Satzmiach. Says the Arizal, we have a tradition, the Gemara in Sukkah talks about it, there are many Midrashim, there are 2 Mashiachs, Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David. Says the Ari, when you say v'Yishalayim Ercha Barachavim Tashav, when you say v'Chisei David Mehira L'Seichach Tachin, what is the throne of David? What is the throne of David HaMelech? The throne of David is Mashiach ben Yosef. Since Mashiach ben Yosef is the Yisroel, is the foundation, the throne of Mashiach ben David is Mashiach ben Yosef. So when you say V'chisei David Mehira L'Seicha Tachin, that's the interval to yearn for the coming and the safe arrival and protection, says the Ari, of Mashiach ben Yosef. But there's another bracha, Es Tzemach David. And when you say Es Tzemach David and you say Ki Lishuascha Kivinu Kol Hayom, for your salvation I wait the whole day, one should have in mind to fulfill the great obligation of being Mitzapel Yeshua. So yes, we live our whole lives. My grandfather, Ze'etzak Levracha, who was a Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Menachem Zemba, he was in Auschwitz, he was in Dachau. He said he believed be'emuna shalema every day in Auschwitz. Mashiach was coming that day. So of course we live our whole lives always awaiting the coming of Mashiach. But the Ari says specifically, it's not good enough to just in general. There's a specific juncture dedicated to Mitzapel Geula when you say the words Ki Lishuascha Kivinu Kol Hayom. There's another important interval. Another important interval is Kabbalah Shabbos. If you notice in L'Chadaydi, in the 9 stanzas of L'Chadaydi, it's primarily not about Shabbos. Maybe 3 of the stanzas are about Shabbos. The majority of it is about rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash, restoring Malchus Beis David, restoring Nevuah, Uri Sher Daberi, expansion of Yerushalayim. Why do we daven for these things in Kabbalah Shabbos? Rav Moshe Shapiro, Ze'etzak Levracha, has an eye-opening insight. He says we find that there's a concept in Machshava that there are places and there are times that are synonymous. There's something called Ashan, Olam, Shana, Nefesh. Olam is place, Shana is time, Nefesh is person. And these ideas could sometimes be synonymous. The Gemara Masechta Taanis tells us, do you know when was the Beis HaMikdash destroyed? What day of the week? The Gemara says the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash were both destroyed Matzai Shabbos. The Maharal explains that it was not coincidental that both Batei Mikdashim were destroyed Matzai Shabbos. Says the Maharal, Shabbos and the Beis HaMikdash are in a way synonymous. What Shabbos is in time, the Beis HaMikdash is in space. And what the Beis HaMikdash is in space, Shabbos is in time. In other words, Shabbos is the Beis HaMikdash of time. The Beis HaMikdash is the Shabbos of space. So the only possibility for there to be destruction of the Beis HaMikdash is when you're moving away from Shabbos. But you're never moving away from Shabbos. You're always moving towards Shabbos. Hayom Yom Rishon v'Shabbos. Hayom Yom Sheni v'Shabbos. The answer is there's one time of the week that you're moving away from Shabbos. Matzai Shabbos. And that's the only, so to speak, gap that could allow for Churban Beis HaMikdash. Says Rav Moshe Shapiro, if Matzai Shabbos is the only opportunity for Churban, then greeting the Shabbos, Kabbalah Shabbos, is the most predisposed time for yearning for the Geula. Says Rav Moshe Shapiro, Halacha L'maisa. After 120, when a person is asked, Tzipisa Yeshua, did you await the coming of Mashiach? When are we supposed to fulfill that? Okay, so we mentioned, the Ari says 3 times a day in the Bracha of Shemona Esrei, says Moshe Shapiro, in a way this juncture is even more designated to be Matzav Yeshua. Kabbalah Shabbos. As you're yearning and you're pining for the Shabbos, you're likewise yearning and pining for the coming of Mashiach. Mikdash Melech Yer Melucha Kumitzi Mitaychafech. We asked Rebbeinu Shem to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Hisnari Me'afra Kumi Al Yad Ben Yishai. Please restore the Malchus Beis David. Uri Shir Daberi Rebbeinu Shem, bring us back to Nevuah. Yamin Usmail Tifroitzi, expand Yerushalayim. Chazal say that Asidin Yerushalayim to expand all the way to Damascus. I'm not sure if Syria is going to be pleased with that, but that's the reality. So in Kabbalah Shabbos, part of Kabbalah Shabbos, the definition of Kabbalah Shabbos is it is a time to yearn for the coming of the Geula. Here's another time. And I want to share with you, we asked if our yearning for the coming of Mashiach is so important that it's one of the 6 questions we're asked after 120, why isn't it one of the mitzvahs in the Torah? The Smak, the Sefer Mitzvahs Katan, says indeed it is one of the 613 mitzvahs. Which mitzvah? The very first mitzvah. The mitzvah, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hoitzeisicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. The mitzvah to remember the reality and the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who took us out of Mitzrayim. Says the Smak, part of belief in Hashem and that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim is just like Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, He likewise is going to take us out of our future galus, and for us, our current galus. Part of Zeicher Litzias Mitzrayim is remembering, just like Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, He'll take us out of the final galus, galus Edom, galus America. So it occurred to me that probably the most famous comments in all the Persia of the whole Ramban, the final comments of Ramban on Parshas Boy, where the Ramban explains, why do we have so many mitzvahs that are Zeicher Litzias Mitzrayim? Why is it so fundamental to always remember the Exodus from Egypt, to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim? And the Ramban says, well, Yitzias Mitzrayim demonstrated the basic tenets of Yahadus, Metzias Hashem, the reality of Hashem, Hashgacha Pratis, reward and punishment, Nevuah. And because Hashem's not going to, so to speak, demonstrate this in every generation, says the Ramban, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, never forget it. Tie it around your arms. Recite it in the Kriya Shema. Affix it to your doorpost. Remember it every Friday night when you make Kiddush, and you don't do Malacha, and you don't eat Chametz on Pesach. In other words, all the mitzvahs that are Zeicher L'Yitzias Mitzrayim, says Ramban, are not small mitzvahs. They loom so large because they remind us of all the great principles demonstrated by Yitzias Mitzrayim. Well, says the Ramban, that's why Chazal tell us that we have to be careful even in what is seemingly a minor mitzvah, because there's no such thing as a minor mitzvah. Each minor mitzvah reminds us of all these great tenets. But if you put this together with the Smak, that part and parcel of remembering Yitzias Mitzrayim is awaiting the coming of Mashiach. The Smak writes that included in Anoichi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hoitzeisicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim is the obligation to be Mitzapeh Yeshua. Well, it would come out then that we almost have constant reminders all day long, not just to remember Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, but also that Hashem will redeem us from our current galus. So every doorway we walk through, it's an opportunity to be Mitzapeh Yeshua. Every time we put on tefillin and we think we're putting on tefillin to remember that Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim and to remember Hashem will redeem us. And every time we make Kiddush, it's a reminder to be Mitzapeh Yeshua. And every time we don't do Malacha on Shabbos, and every time we say the Kriya Shema. So in other words, we literally have reminders all day long, not only to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, but to be Mitzapel Yeshua, Ki Lishuascha, Kivinu Kol Hayoim. I would say that's a third opportunity to be Mitzapel Yeshua. And here's number 4. Number 4, friends, is right now. Number 4 is in the era that we're living through, in the era of Golus Yishmael. Even though you look in the Medrash Rabbah, and the Medrash Rabbah in Kama v'Kama L'Koymais talks about Daled Golusim, Bavel, Madai, or Paras, Yavan, and Edom. And it almost seems like there's an obvious Golus that it omitted. What happened to Golus Yishmael? We're going to deal with that question. But there is something called Golus Yishmael. That Rizal writes in Likutei Torah Parshas Kiseitze, says the Ari, that when Daniel saw a vision, he saw the head represents Bavel, the 2 arms, Paras and Madai, the Guf Yavan, and the 2 long legs, Edom and Yishmael. Yet in the Midrashim, Yishmael is never mentioned as a Galus. And this is a question of the Maharal in Netzach Yisrael and in other places. Why has Yishmael not made the list? But one thing we do know is the amazing prophecy of the Baal HaTurim at the end of Parshas Chayisara. In Parshas Chayisara and Zoaf al Pnei Kol Echav Nafal, it's talking about the family of Yishmael. That when Yishmael falls, says the Baal HaTurim, Ve'ele told us Yitzchak, Oz Yitzmach ben David. Do you know when Mashiach comes? Mashiach comes when you see the downfall of Yishmael in the end of days. The Baal HaTurim writes explicitly, when Yishmael falls in the end of days, says the Baal HaTurim, Kishe Yipol Yishmael bi'achris hayomim Oz Yitzmach ben David. So if you're living in an era where you begin to see, yes, the ascendancy, and yes, the downfall of Yishmael, then you know Mashiach ben David is just around the corner. So an appropriate juncture to gear up, to magnify, to intensify feelings of being Mitzapel Yeshua is definitely in Golus Yishmael. Why is Yishmael not on the list? I want to share with you 2 frightening Gemaras, and then we're going to come back to that question. The Gemara Masechta Avodah Zarah on Daf Beis Amud Beis, Beis Amud Aleph, going on to Beis Amud Beis, says in the end of days Hashem's going to take the Sefer Torah, and He's going to say, anyone who was involved with this, come get your schar. The Gemara says all the nations of the world are going to clamor, yes, we supported Torah, we gave Torah the ability to flourish. Everyone's going to want to claim the reward. And Hashem says, order please, you can't come to Erbuvia. And the Gemara says the nations are going to line up, and says the Gemara, the first nation to say that they were involved in supporting Torah is Rome. Rome's going to say, we made marketplaces, we made bathhouses, and everything we did is Kadesh Yasak Yisrael B'Torah. And Hashem's going to say, you fools, that's not what you intended for. In other words, yes, in my plan, that's what it was for, but that wasn't your kavana. And the Gemara says Rome walks out, Edom walks out dejected. Whereupon Paras walks in, and Paras is going to say, we waged wars, we conquered cities. Everything we did was so that the Jewish people should be able to learn Torah. And again, Hashem is going to say, you fools, that's not what your kavana was. And they're going to walk out dejected. Ask the Gemara, why will the nations that come in the end of days be Roimi and Paras? Says the Gemara, because Rome and Persia are chashuv, they're important. Ask the Gemara, why are they important? Says the Gemara, because they will last until Mashiach comes. Misham dahanach mashchi b'malchusayu ad asi Mashiach. There'll only be 2 nations that maintain power when Mashiach comes: Rome and Persia. Hafla v'fela. Says the Gemara, a prophecy that in the end of days there'll be 2 nations standing, Rome and Persia. So you could say, well, we don't know what this means. It's an Agadata. I mean, the Roman Empire fell more than 1,500 years ago. What's Rome today? Well, many say Rome today is the United States of America. The country that espouses Judeo-Christian values is the United States of America. Someone even showed me the Ben Ish Chai writes this beferish. So Rome is America, but what in the world is Paras? Persia will last until Mashiach comes. The Persian Empire is long gone. If you want to see a relic of the Persian Empire, you could go to the British Museum. There they have a mug. In this mug that a Persian drank coffee in 1,500 years ago, but they don't have the cup, they only have the handle. That's what's left of the Persian Empire. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, it means Iran. No, Iran has no connection whatsoever to the Persian Empire. Not ethnically, not genetically. They're a different race, they're a different culture, they're a different ethnicity. If it makes you feel better to think that what the Gemara refers to as the United States and Iran, so be it. Seemingly that's not what the Gemara is talking about. But I want to share with you another Gemara, and we're going to wrap it up. The Gemara in Yuma Daf Yud says the Gemara, we know there'll be two nations that last until Mashiach comes. Who will defeat who? Says the Gemara, Rebbe says, Rome will fall to Persia. Now, if you would have asked me, who will be the last nation standing when Mashiach comes? As an American, you would like to think the United States of America will be the last nation standing. The Gemara says no, Rome will fall to Persia. Comes Rabbi Yochanan, Rome will fall to Persia. And then the Gemara says, but Rav holds, Asida Parasha Tipo Biad Roimi. Persia will fall to Rome. So it's actually a machloikis in the Gemara, whether, if you hold that Rome is the United States of America, which again, many achronim do say, it is a machloikes, whether they will be the last nation standing. And that's very frightening. But it also begs the question, who exactly is Paras? Let's come back to the question of the Maral. Why is Yishmael not one of the four Golosim? The Maral first gives a different answer, a brilliant answer, but the Maral says that's not the definitive answer, so we'll have to save that for another occasion. For the sake of time, let's go with the answer the Maral considers the definitive answer, why Yishmael is not one of the four Golosim. Says the Maral, Yishmael is one of the four Golosim. Which one? Paras. Ask Maral, but Paras fell already to Yavan more than 1,000 years ago. Says the Maral, the definition of a Golus is not a culture, it's not an ethnicity, it's a personality trait. And the Persians, says the Gemara, waged wars, conquered cities. This describes perfectly the characteristics of Yishmael. Yishmael is synonymous with Paras. To me, this insight opens up the heavens and opens up Shas. That means when the Gemara in the beginning of Avodah Zarah says there'll be two nations standing until Mashiach comes, those two nations are Roimi, the United States of America, and Paras, Yishmael. And that's exactly what we see in our times before the coming of Mashiach. There are two nations standing, there are two world powers. The Western world, the United States of America, and Yishmael and our cousins. And until the great day comes, the battle of civilization is Paras versus Roimi. So you say that's terrifying. First of all, it's stunning that the Gemara written 1,500 years ago is giving us such a precise prophecy of which nations will be standing in the end of days. But it's so frightening because who will be the last nation standing? And the Gemara in Yuma is saying it's Machlokes. And Rebbe says it's Paras, it's Yishmael. And Rabbi Yochanan says it's Paras, it's Yishmael. But Rab says it's Roimi, It's the United States of America. And, I mean, that's frightening to think that there are deos in the Gemara that Yishmael could be the last nation standing other than Klal Yisrael before Mashiach comes. And if you wanted to know, is there a definitive view on the subject? If you look in Tosfos and Avodah Zarah Daf Beis Amud Beis, Tosfos quotes only the opinion that Rome will be the last nation standing. But I must say, comes Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and he writes this in his commentary on the Haggadah Shel Pesach, that in his view, and we don't have time to go through all of his proofs, in his view there is no question Yishmael will be the last nation standing. And he proves it from the Baal HaTurim we quoted, that in the end of days, and when Yishmael falls, that's when Mashiach ben David will come. By the way, the Gra writes explicitly like this. The Gra writes there are two Mashiachs. There's Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. Mashiach ben Yosef, who's compared to a shar, will take us out of Golos Edom. Edom is compared to a par, a shar. And Yosef is Bachar Shoyrei Hadarlai. But says the Goin, Yishmael is Ani V'roichiv al Chamar. It's the Golos of the Chamar. So Mashiach ben David will come and take us out of Golos Yishmael. He's Ani V'roichiv al Chamar. He'll take us out of the Golos of Shavulachem Payim HaChamar. So the Goin also is maintaining that first is Mashiach ben Yosef out of Golos Edom, and then is Mashiach ben David out of Golos Yishmael. So that alone is a very frightening and unsettling thought. I would like to share with you what I think is a very reasonable perspective on this. You know, we tend to think that when the Gemara says in the end of days there'll be two nations standing, Roimi and Paras, and they'll be battling it out, and we think, one will destroy the other. We think, how will one destroy the other? One nation will conquer the other. There'll be war, maybe nuclear, chas v'shalom. In our minds, that's how we envision how things will play out. That when the Gemara says there'll be two nations standing, it will be Paras, Yishmael, against Roimi, they're going to fight against each other, a physical battle. I don't think so. Doesn't have to be. If anybody knows history, and if anybody knows anything about the fall of the Roman Empire, so, the fall of the Roman Empire, Persia came now, so Persia must have come and conquered Rome. That's not what happened. If anybody knows anything about the fall of the Roman Empire, nobody conquered the Roman Empire. There was political disillusionment. They had no values. It disintegrated. It just came apart by the seams. It just crumbled by the seams. Internal internal breakup. And that's what we see today. When the Gemara says there'll be two nations standing in the end of days, there'll be two value systems in this world. You'll have the value system of the Western world, which perhaps originally was based on Judeo-Christian values. And you'll have the extremist value system of Yishmael. And perhaps the question is, which value system will stand longer until Mashiach comes and shows the world, V'haya Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz? It doesn't necessarily mean Yishmael will conquer Roimi. But what we're seeing in our times is, does the country we live in even have values? Or in a way, Masei Avos Simen Lebanim, the same way the Roman Empire was never conquered. It, so to speak, fell apart at the seams. Disillusionment. They realized they were bereft of any value. Of course the country was built on principle. But look what's happening to the value system in Roimi today in the United States of America. And in a way, we see already, like the Gemara seems to conclude, and like Reb Chaim says, Asida Roimi Shetipo Biad Paras. Because as extreme as the other side is, there's a value system, albeit not a good one. And that's the debate in the Gemara. Which value system, perhaps, will remain until Mashiach comes? But one thing's for sure. Galus Yishmael is the beginning of the footsteps of the coming of Mashiach. And if there was ever a time in the history of the world for us to be Matzav Yeshua, for us to yearn for Hashem's salvation, yes, when we say a Semach David, yes, when we say Kabbalah Shabbos, yes, every time we perform a mitzvah that's Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim, but in the times we're living through the Al Pnei Kol Echav Nafal, we need to be thinking and yearning and pining for the Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak. You know, sometimes we think the Rebbeinu Shalom, He didn't bring the Geula for our Zaydas, for our grandparents, for greater tzaddikim than us. Will He bring the Geula for us? Just want to close with one simple, astounding insight of Reb Schwab on the words Ahava Rabba Ahavtanu. Reb Schwab writes, people think the words Ahava Rabba means with a great love, Hashem, you loved us. Says Reb Schwab, it means much more than that. Rabba does not just mean great. Rabba means expanding. Rabba means growing. Rabba means getting bigger. Ahava Rabba Ahavtanu Hashem Elokeinu. The Rebbeinu Shalom loved Klal Yisrael when He took us out of Mitzrayim, but He loved Klal Yisrael more when He gave us the Torah, and He loved Klal Yisrael more when He gave us the Mishnah, and His love increased when He gave us the Gemara. And says Reb Schwab, we see in our times the proliferation of yeshivas and koilelim and svarim and shiurim in a way that Klal Yisrael never saw. This is an illustration, a manifestation of something called Ahava Rabba Ahavtanu, the growing love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Knesset Yisrael. And if the Rebbeinu Shalom didn't bring the Geula for the last dar, perhaps that's because His love was not as infinite as it is to us today. So, Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that if only we would properly be mitzapeh l'geula, that itself would be the zechus for the geula to come. So let's try to heighten our hargasha of genuinely yearning when we daven in the Shemona Esrei, v'chisei David Avdecha, ki lishuascha kivinu ka'ayim, when we're mekabel the Shabbos, when we're mekayim mitzvahs that remind us of Yetzias Mitzrayim. But in our era of the end of Galus Yishmael, this is our opportunity all day long. Ki lishuascha kivinu kal hayom, and we should be zoiche, and that's zechus, and zechus of our getting together this morning, and all the efforts that our community has put in together with all of Klal Yisrael. We should be zoiche to the Bias Goel Tzedek b'mher v'yameinu. Amen. Thank you very much.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.